Shamanism and Witchcraft amongst the Kolarian Tribes. By Ewen. Having resided for some years amongst the Mimadas and Hos of Sikphum, and Shutia Agpa, my attention was drawn at times to customs differing a good deal in some ways, but having an evident affinity to those related of the Illyri Kurumbas in Mrs. Morgan's article. I do not mean to say that the practices I am about to mention are confined simply to the Kolarian tribes, as I am aware both Orals, a Dravidian tribe, and the different Hindu castes living side by side with the Kols, count many noted wizards among their number. But what little I have come to know of these curious customs, I have learnt among the Mimadas and Hos, some of the most celebrated practitioners among them being Christian converts. The people themselves say that these practices are peculiar to their race, and not learnt from the Hindu invaders of their plateau, but I am inclined to think that some, at least, of the operations have a strong savour of the tantric black magic about them, though practiced by people who are often entirely ignorant of any Hindu language. These remarks must be supplemented by a short sketch of Kol ideas of worship. They have nothing that I have either seen or heard of in the shape of an image, but their periodical offerings are made to a number of elemental spirits, and they assign a genie to every rock or tree in the country, whom they do not consider altogether malignant, but who, if not duly fed or propitiated, may become so. The Sigboga, lit, sun or light spirit, is the chief. Puruboga, spirit of the hills, and the Ikhboga, spirit of the deep, come next. After these come the Daha, of which each family has its own, and they may be considered in the same light as Lares and Penates. But every threshing, flour and oil mill, has its spirit, who must be duly fed, else evil result may be expected. Their great festival, the Karam, is in honor of Sigboga and his assistants. The opening words of the priest's speech on that occasion sufficiently indicate that they consider Sigboga, the creator of men and things. Mur Sigboga mero kolu ekidko, in the beginning Sigboga made men. Each village has its Sara or sacred grove, where the hereditary priest from time to time performs sacrifices, to keep things prosperous, but this only relates to spirits actually connected with the village. The three greater spirits mentioned, being considered general, are only fed at intervals of 3 or more years, and always on a public road or other public place, and once every 10 years a human being was, and as some will tell you is, sacrificed to keep the whole community of spirits in good train. The Paharens, or village priests, are regular servants of the spirits, and the Najo, Dioa and Bhagats are people who in some way are supposed to obtain an influence or command over them. The first and lowest grade of these adepts, called Najos, which may be translated as practitioners of witchcraft pure and simple, are frequently women. They are accused, like the Mula Kurumbas, of demanding quantities of grain or loans of money, and c. from people, and when these demands are refused, they go away with a remark to the effect that you have lots of cattle and grain just now, but we'll see what they are like after a month or two. Then probably the cattle of the bewitched person will get some disease, and several of them die, or some person of his family will become ill or get hurt in some unaccountable way. Till at last, thoroughly frightened, the afflicted person takes a little uncooked rice and goes to a dioa or matey, as he is called in the different vernaculars of the province, the grade immediately above Najo in knowledge, and promising him a reward if he will assist him, requests his aid. If the dioa accedes to the request, the proceedings are as follows. The dioa, taking the oil brought, lights a small lamp and seats himself beside it with the rice in a suapa, winoa, in his hands. After looking intently at the lamp flame for a few minutes, he begins to sing a sort of chaunt of invocation in which all the spirits are named, and at the name of each spirit a few grains of rice are thrown into the lamp. When the flame at any particular name gives a jump and flares up high, the spirit concerned in the mischief is indicated. Then the dioa takes a small portion of the rice wrapped up in a sal, shoria robusta, leaf and proceeds to the nearest new white ant nest, from which he cuts the top off and lays the little bundle, half in and half out of the cavity. Having retired, he returns in about an hour to see if the rice is consumed, and according to the rapidity with which it is eaten he predicts the sacrifice which will appease the spirit. This ranges from a fowl to a buffalo, but whatever it may include, the pouring out of blood is an essential. It must be noted, however, that the matey never tells who the najo is who has excited the malignity of the spirit. But the most important and lucrative part of a dioa's business is the casting out of evil spirits, which operation is known variously as Ashabi and Lagha. The sign of obsession is generally some mental alienation accompanied, in bad cases, by a combined trembling and restlessness of limbs, or an unaccountable swelling up of the body. Whatever the symptoms may be, the mode of cure appears to be much the same. On such symptoms declaring themselves, the dioa is brought to the house and is in the presence of the sick man and his friends provided with some rice in a supper, some oil, a little vermilion, and the dioa produces from his own person a little powdered sulphur and an iron tube about 4 inches long and 2 tickles *. Before the proceedings begin all the things mentioned are touched with vermilion, a small quantity of which is also mixed with the rice. 3 or 4 grains of rice and one of the tickles being put into the tube, a lamp is then lighted beside the sick man and the dioa begins his chaunt, throwing grains of rice at each name, and when the flame flares up, a little of the powdered sulphur is thrown into the lamp and a little on the sick man, who thereupon becomes convulsed, is shaken all over and talks deliriously, the dioa's chaunt growing louder all the while. Suddenly the convulsions and the chaunt cease, and the Deo carefully takes up a little of the sulfur off the man's body and puts into the tube, which he then seals with the second tikli. The Deo and one of the man's friends then leave the hut, taking the iron tube and rice with them, the spirit being now supposed out of the man and bottled up in the iron tube. They hurry across country until they leave the hut some miles behind. Then they go to the edge of some tank or river, to some place they know to be frequented by people for the purposes of bathing, and see, where, after some further ceremony, the iron is stuck into the ground and left there. This is done with the benevolent intention that the spirit may transfer its attentions to the unfortunate person who may happen to touch it while bathing. I am told the spirit in this case usually chooses a young and healthy person. Should the Deo think the spirit has not been able to suit itself with a new receptacle, he repairs to where a bazaar is taking place and there, after some ceremony, he mixes with the crowd, and taking a grain of the reddened rice jerks it with his forefinger and thumb in such a way that without attracting attention it falls on the person or clothes of some. This is done several times to make certain. Then the Deo declares he has done his work, and is usually treated to the best dinner the sick man's friends can afford. It is said that the person to whom the spirit by either of these methods is transferred may not be affected for weeks or even months. But some fine day while he is at his work, he will suddenly stop, wheel round 2 or 3 times on his heels and fall down more or less convulsed. From that time forward he will begin to be troubled in the same way as his disobsessed predecessor was. Having thus given some account of the Deo, we now come to the Bhagat, called by the Hindus Sokhar and Sivath. This is the highest grade of all, and, as I ought to have mentioned before, the knowledge, of both the Deo and Bhagat grades is only to be learned by becoming a regular chela of a practitioner, but I am given to understand that the final initiation is much hastened by a seasonable liberality on the part of the chela. During the initiation of the Sokhar certain ceremonies are performed at night by aid of a human corpse. This is one of the things which has led me to think that this part at least of these practices is connected with tantric black magic. The Bhagat performs 2 distinct functions. First, a kind of divination called Pau, the same in Hindi, and, second, a kind of shamanism called Darista in Hindi, and Barota in Horokaji, which, however, is resorted to only on very grave occasions as, for instance, when several families think they are bewitched at one time and by the same ajo. The Pau is performed as follows. The person having some query to propound, makes a small dish out of a sal leaf and puts in it a little uncooked rice and a few pice. He then proceeds to the Bhagat and lays before him the leaf and its contents, propounding at the same time his query. The Bhagat then directs him to go out and gather 2 golaichai, varieties of posaya, flowers, such practitioners usually having a golaichai tree close to their abodes, After the flowers are brought, the Bhagat seats himself with the rice close to the inquirer, and after some consideration selects one of the flowers, and holding it by the stalk at about a foot from his eyes in his left hand twirls it between his thumb and fingers, occasionally with his right hand dropping on it a grain or two of rice. In a few minutes his eyes close and he begins to talk, usually about things having nothing to do with the question in hand, but after a few minutes of this, he suddenly yells out an answer to the question, and without another word retires. The inquirer takes his meaning as he can from the answer, which, I believe, is always ambiguous. The Barota, as I have above remarked, is only resorted to when a matter of grave import has to be inquired about. The Bhagat makes a high charge for a séance of this description. We will fancy that 3 or 4 families in a village consider themselves bewitched by a Rajo, and they resolve to have recourse to a Bhagat to find out who the witch is. With this view a day is fixed on, and 2 delegates are procured from each of 5 neighboring villages, who accompany the afflicted people to the house of the Bhagat, taking with them a dali or offering, consisting of vegetables, which on arrival is formally presented to him. 2 delegates are posted at each of the 4 points of the compass, and the other 2 seat themselves with the afflicted parties to the right of the Bhagat, who occupies the center of the apartment with 4 or 5 chelas, a clear space being reserved on the left. One chela then brings a small earthenware pot full of lighted charcoal, which is set before the Bhagat with a pile of mango wood chips and a ball composed of duya, resin of Shoria robusta, ghee, treacle, and ghee, clarified butter, and possibly other ingredients. The Bhagat's sole attire consists of a scanty laguti, waistcloth, a necklace of the large wooden beads such as are usually worn by fakirs, and several garlands of golachai flowers round his neck, his hair being unusually long and matted. Beside him stuck in the ground is his staff. One chela stands over the fire pot with a bamboo mat fan in his hand, another takes charge of the pile of chips, and a third of the ball of composition, and 1 or 2 others seat themselves behind the Bhagat, with drums and other musical instruments in their hands. All being in readiness, the afflicted ones are requested to state their grievance. This they do, and pray the Bhagat to call before him the Najo, who has stirred up the spirits to afflict them, in order that he may be punished. The Bhagat then gives a sign to his chelas. Those behind him raise a furious din with their instruments. The fire is fed with chips, and a bit of the composition is put on it from time to time, producing a volume of thick greyish-blue smoke. This is carefully fanned over, and towards the Bhagat, who, when well wrapped in smoke, closes his eyes and quietly swaying his body begins a low chaunt. The chaunt gradually becomes louder and the sway of his body more pronounced, until he works himself into a state of complete frenzy. Then with his body actually quivering, and his head rapidly working about from side to side, he sings in a loud voice how a certain Najo, whom he names, had asked money of those people and was refused, and how he stirred up certain spirits, whom he also names, to hurt them, how they killed so and so's bullocks, someone else's sheep, and caused another's child to fall ill. Then he begins to call on the Najo to come and answer for his doings, and in doing so rises to his feet, still commanding the Najo to appear. Meanwhile he reels about, then falls on the ground and is quite still except for an occasional whine, and a muttered, "I see him. He is coming." This state may last for an hour or more till at last the Bhagat sits up and announces the Ajo has come. As he says so, a man, apparently mad with drink, rushes in and falls with his head towards the Bhagat, moaning and making a sort of snorting as if half stifled. In this person the bewitched parties often recognize a neighbor and sometimes even a relation, but whoever he may be they have bound themselves to punish him. The Bhagat then speaks to him and tells him to confess, at the same time threatening him, in case of refusal, with his staff. He then confesses in a half-stupefied manner, and his confession tallies with what the Bhagat has told in his frenzy. The Ajo is then dismissed and runs out of the house in the same hurry as he came in. The delegates then hold a council at which the Najo usually is sentenced to a fine often heavy enough to ruin him and expelled from his village. Before the British rule the convicted Najo seldom escaped with his life, and during the mutiny time, when no Englishmen were about, the Sikhum Hoes paid off a large number of old scores of this sort. For record of which, see Statistical Account of Bengal, Volume 17. p. 52. In conclusion, I have merely to add that I have derived this information from people who have been actually concerned in these occurrences, and among others a man belonging to a village of my own, who was convicted and expelled from the village with the loss of all his movable property, and one of his victims, a relation of his, sat by me when the above was being written. This audio file was created by Payoprita Basic. You can download it at payoprita.com.